to go, sir. We can start the session.
Okay, so good evening, everybody, and thanks for
Good evening, doctor.
yes. And so the topic that we have chosen today for the discussion is fungal infections in transplant patients. So basically, it deals with development of fungal infections after organ transplants. So if we talk about invasive fungal infections in transplant patients, it occurs in around 0.7 to 23% of individuals after transplant. And Candida and Aspergillus account for most of these invasive fungal infections. Once you develop fungal infections, the mortality is quite high. It goes up to one-fourth to one-third of people developing this fungal infection die. Even if they survive, it adds on to significant cost and significant prolonged hospital stay. The mortality remains maximum with aspergillosis as compared to the rest of the viruses. So when we talk about invasive fungal infections, the infections which are for important for us are Candida, and Candida can be albicans and non-albicans. I would like to stress that non-albicans are of specific importance because a lot of them would be resistant to fluconazole. Aspergillosis, mucormycosis, cryptococcosis, and pneumocystis are there, but they are less common. The most routinely that we see is Candida, Aspergillus, and mucormycosis. If we talk about the organ transplants and development of invasive fungal infections, so if we see the highest risk is with small bowel transplants, then the lung, then liver 4.7, which we see, heart 4%, pancreas 3.4%, and after renal transplants. So renal transplants are relatively safer as compared to the rest of the transplants. Now, if we look at the data about invasive fungal infections among transplant recipients from the data from the TransNet, or what we call as Transplant Associated Infection Surveillance Network, candidiasis occupies 50%, more than 50% of all invasive fungal infections are because of candidiasis. The next 19% is aspergillosis, cryptococcosis in 8%, zygomycosis is seen in just 2% of cases. This is from United States. Going into the detail of this data, so the timing of development of this fungal infection. So if we see from top to bottom on the figure, the earliest are the Candida and the Aspergillus. So they develop nearly within the 6 months of your transplant, while Cryptococcus develops more than a year after the transplant. This is the average time. Which this slide I've already mentioned that small bowel and lungs are the highest risk for development of invasive fungal infections. Liver comes in somewhere in between. The cumulative incidence of candidiasis is much higher than aspergillosis. So usually 3 times much more incidence of candidiasis is seen as compared to aspergillosis. Now, if we look at data from Asia, something which is published from Korea, so they included 482 patients of liver transplant, and of this 4.8% develop invasive fungal infections, which is similar to data from TransNet. Candida 52, similar. Aspergillus 30.4%. The most common site of development of fungal infection is usually intra-abdominal. We come across post-liver transplant with Candida ascites quite often. Pulmonary aspergillosis, lung is involvement. Catheter, UTI, and skin and soft tissue would be less likely sites, but the abdominal and the lung are the most common site of development of invasive intrafungal infections. If we look at the survival, we all know that once we develop invasive intrafungal infections, the survival is not good and it is quite significantly low. Similar when we look at the data from renal transplant patient. Now this study is published from our own city of Ahmedabad, where from IKDRC in renal transplant patients, where 1.56% on triple immunosuppressions develop invasive fungal infections. But of those who develop fungal infections, nearly one-third of those with aspergillus and one-fourth of those with candida succumb to the disease after renal transplant. Coming to heart transplant, also this is a single center experience, a 7-year follow-up study. published 5 years back, where they said that 10% incidence of invasive fungal infection after heart transplant. Now this is an interesting paper where they have looked at the feared 5 fungal infections in kidney transplant patients, a 20-year experiences from a single center. They said that because it is very difficult to differentiate which candida were actually invasive and which were just mucosal or cutaneous, so they have not considered candida as in their calculations. But there are more than 900 cases were seen of candida. But they have looked at aspergillosis, cryptococcosis, histoblasto, and coccidiomycosis. So if you look at the number of aspergillosis, 72 aspergillus were compared to 900 candida cases. But if we look at the mean interval from transplant to development of infection, it is quite delayed, 2.8 years, 3.6 years for cryptococcosis. But if you look at the graph survival after infection, it is very poor. A lot of people develop graft failure within a year or two after developing an invasive fungal infections. But if we look at this number of patients with biopsy proven rejection within the 6 months before the fungal infection, so nearly more than actually 1/4 of the patients who develop aspergillosis had recent history of acute rejection for which they required higher immunosuppressions. Slight data about the mucormycosis. It's in renal transplant where they looked at 174 reported cases. Rhinocerebral was the most common site of infection. Rhizopus is the most common fungus, and the mortality rates associated with disseminated mucormycosis is 76%, significantly higher. So the outcome of mucormycosis in transplant patient is quite poor. Coming to risk factors of development of invasive fungal infection. Now we know it is always host factors and the fungal factors. In the host factors, because of the immunosuppressions, we have suppressed the immunity. Besides, whenever there is breach in the integrity of the anatomical barriers, there is high risk of development of fungal infections other than the fungal factors. So we look at the breaches in the natural barriers. It may be a surgical procedures, there may be a biliary leak, the presence of prosthetic material, intravenous catheters, intratracheal tube. Overall, higher the immunosuppression is required, massive transfusions are required, renal replacement are required, then they are responsible for development of invasive fungal infections. Besides, if the host is suffering from age, malnutrition, diabetes, poor immune status, or overall other chronic organ dysfunctions, they have high likelihood of development of infections. So the risk factor remains indwelling catheters, central lines, abdominal wounds, drains, any secondary surgery, so a person who requires a re-exploration after a transplant, or a persistent require of parenteral nutrition or a prolonged ventilation, they are at a high risk of development of invasive fungal infections. Coming to liver transplant patients for invasive candidiasis, if we see why liver transplants are at high risk for invasive candidiasis, because it has technical complexity of surgery. It is prolonged surgery, it requires a lot of anastomosis, prolonged operation time, multiple blood transfusions are required, and biliary anastomosis and the risk of biliary leak. So liver transplant remains high risk for invasive candidiasis. Even then, in those patients who are actually having transplanted for acute liver failure, who are having allograft failure or severe organ dysfunction after transplant, who require a retransplantation or requiring a renal replacement therapy, they are even at a higher risk of development of candidiasis after transplantation. So if we look at the invasive candidiasis, it is or invasive aspergillosis, renal replacement therapy and retransplantation are common for both of the factors, but higher transfusion requirement and higher procedure requirement are also risk factors. We should also keep in mind that around 1% of the organ transplants are complicated by donor-derived infections, and approximately nearly 3% of the preservation fluids which have been used have shown candida in their fluid. So we know that aspergillus and candida are the most common fungus. They once they are occurring, they can cause high mortality. The overall, if we see the with all the transplant, it is seen though common with lung transplant, but it is quite high as well with the liver transplants and slightly less with the kidney transplants. Coming to the diagnostic modalities of invasive fungal infections in these patients. So obviously medical history, we know that there are risk factors. Patient is having a re-exploration, patient is having a hepatic artery thrombosis, or patient are requiring multiple transfusions. We know patient having clinical evidence of SARS or sepsis. When we require for a microscopic examination and advise special stains of PAS or GIMSA stain to look for fungi. But coming for a clinician's point of view, the tests that we routinely use are galactomannan and beta-D-glucan. Fungal PCR are not commercially available, though I would just mention at a later part of my talk that they are the upcoming thing. So galactomannan is for Aspergillus only, and it can come false positive with beta-lactam antibiotics. While beta-D-glucan is positive in Candida as well as Aspergillus, and it can come false positive with dialysis filter, albumin and IVIG. There is some debate about its cutoff. So looking at this, how these tests perform overall, if we see in a systemic review and a meta-analysis of diagnostic accuracy of BDG for invasive fungal infection, which is published I think 5 years back. So they have looked at the various studies which have used BDG for candidiasis and aspergillosis. If we look at the previous studies for aspergillosis, the sensitivity was nearly 100% for both. But if you look at the recent data, it is good 66% in the last study from 2012, and for aspergillosis, while 93 for candidiasis. Coming to specificity, I think the specificity for invasive fungal infection for BDG is 0.8% as a part of this meta-analysis. If we look at the ability to diagnose aspergillosis with galactomannan is quite high, with those having no aspergillus to those having aspergillus is quite different, and they're at a cutoff of 0.5. The area under AUROC is 0.77. Coming to BDG, there is quite overlap between no invasive fungal infections and invasive fungal infections, though it seems that it has quite good negative predictive value. But if we use a cutoff of 80, the AUROC comes at 0.56, which is not very good. So they summarize that if we looked at the galactomannan with a cutoff of 0.5, the sensitivity is nearly 100%. So it has very high positive negative predictive value. Similarly, for BDG at a cutoff of 80 at baseline, the sensitivity is 100. So negative predictive value remains quite good for both of these tests. We in our post-transplant patient do not use it as an absolute value to titrate our treatment, but we use sequential values and see the monitor the treatment, and sometimes to rule out invasive fungal infection by their negative value. Just something about BAL guided sample aspiration and then sending galactomannan through in that sample is quite important if we are suspecting aspergillosis. There are a lot of PCR panels nowadays available, though it is not easily available in our setup, but they are upcoming. So pan-fungal PCRs are there, Aspergillus PCR, Candida PCR, and real-time pneumocystis PCRs are there. So these are just certain PCR panels, and there are different countries for aspergillosis and similarly for Candida. There are specific PCRs which looked at only certain Candida species, so we need to be aware of it. Coming to the diagnosis of invasive Candida infection, I think there are two ways to diagnose for us. We use it as a microscopic analysis and a culture. If we are able to find on the culture growth or on a microscopic analysis of a tissue, then we label them as invasive Candida infection. Imaging also helps significantly. So this is a CT scan showing Aspergillus infection, which was later investigated to found out Aspergillus. This is an X-ray finding of a pneumocystis pneumonia. So, in a radiological guided pulmonary involvement, radiological guidance for pulmonary disease is quite important. Now, I think this is very important slide where we would see how each of the with clinical correlation how to go among, how to diagnose each type of fungal infection. So if a patient has persistent pyrexia and no respiratory signs or symptoms, usually early after a solid organ transplant, likely to be candida, and we usually diagnose candida by blood culture or a culture of a recently placed abdominal drain in case of abdominal candidiasis. We use beta D glucan quite often in this condition, and the treatment remains echinocandins. However, if we see nodular lung lesions with or without fever, fever may be absent in presence of steroid, usually after a lung or a heart transplant, and even an early period. If the suspicion of fungus is Aspergillus, and main diagnostic remains microscopy and culture of Aspergillus and guided by galactomannan. So if galactomannan is positive, we go ahead with invasive test and confirm Aspergillus on the test. The treatment of choice again is voriconazole. If we see ground glass opacities, I think I would not go into detail of pneumocystis. This is seen, I think those who have treated HIV patients previously have seen a lot of pneumocystis, but the diagnosis remains again microscopy in BAL with support provided by radiology. Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole is the treatment of choice. For rhino-sino-orbital infection, if the site is there, we all know it is usually mucor, so we need help from our ENT surgeons who would give us a good sample, good histological tissue, after which they would also help with debridement and a long-term amphotericin treatment. But the problem with diagnosing fungal infection is getting a histology is not always possible. The cost of the therapy is so prohibitive that empirical therapy for all is not easily possible. There are all the modalities that we use have low sensitivity specificity. So most of our cirrhotic patients who come to us have persistently high beta D glucan above more than 300 and more than 400, and we do not know how significant it is. And sometimes non-culture based diagnosis, so accuracy is affected by various other conditions as I previously mentioned. Just a small thing on antifungal sensitivity testing. Now we don't routinely perform antifungal sensitivity testing for all our patients, but whenever we are suspecting Candida non-albicans, we usually ask for sensitivity testing because we need to know whether they are resistant to the routine azoles or not. So unless you are suspecting resistant fungus, antifungal sensitivity testing is not routinely performed, but it is available and everyone should be aware of this test, and they should request their microbiologist to go ahead and get this sensitivity testing carried out. Coming to treatment options, I think antifungal treatment strategies remains prophylaxis, preemptive, empirical, and targeted. So prophylaxis is when we give a prophylaxis before development. Preemptive is when we know that there is high likelihood of them getting a fungal infection, we give preemptive therapy. Empirical is when there is probable diagnosis of fungal infection, we have not yet identified the organism or the species, we start empirical, and then finally the targeted therapy. The options available with us are divided into three groups. They are azoles, polyenes, and echinocandins. So azoles are the only ones which are available in oral formulation. The ones are fluconazole, posaconazole, and voriconazole for our patients. Itraconazole I don't think that we use quite often in our liver patients, but it is an option as well. Fluconazole has sensitivity and response only against Candida albicans. So as soon as you see Candida non-albicans in your culture, you should start on other antifungals and not depend on fluconazole. Posaconazole, again orally available. It can be used as aspergillus, and it is officially recommended for prophylaxis for aspergillus. Voriconazole for invasive aspergillosis as well as non-albicans species candidiasis, we can use it. Echinocandins, Annadula fungin, Caspofungin, and Mica fungin. I think they are all the Candida species are usually susceptible to this antifungals. Any of these three can be used for Candida, but just keep in mind that Caspofungin is problematic in patients with liver disease, and Caspofungin should be avoided in patients with liver disease. Polyenes, I think most of us have experience with liposomal amphotericin B now, and it is active against most of the systemic fungal infections, and including aspergillus, polyenes are active. Now coming to approach, now you have a reasonable doubt that there is patient is having a fungal infection, you don't have a culture back, and you are starting with an empirical therapy. Then what should be your empirical therapy? So fever, febrile neutropenia, they carried out a study, this is quite old, where they have seen 849 patients, where patients were compared with voriconazole and liposomal amphotericin B, and they found out that overall response rate in voriconazole was 26% as compared to 30% in patient with liposomal amphotericin B, and they recommend that in patients whom empirical therapy has to be given, liposomal amphotericin B should be preferred over voriconazole. Coming to specific therapy, targeted therapy or definitive therapy, coming to Candida treatment. So this is very important. Invasive candidiasis, if it is there, the first choice is echinocandins and not azoles. It can be any echinocandins, but in liver disease, just remember to avoid caspofungin. Amphotericin B is an alternative. Coming to the IDSA guidelines, Candidemia neutropenic patient, echinocandin is the treatment of choice. Hepatosplenic, again an echinocandin or amphotericin. Intra-abdominal candidiasis, you need to control the source, so we need to drain or debride if there is a source of intra-abdominal collection, and an echinocandin is the treatment of choice. Now coming to aspergillosis, so what should be the treatment of aspergillosis? And the entire the guidelines, I think the main paper which guided voriconazole to become the primary treatment or preferred treatment for invasive aspergillosis was this, published in NEJM again 18 years back. So where 391 patients were included from 95 centers in 19 countries, and they assessed the outcome at 12 weeks. So if we look at the outcome in these two groups, so voriconazole 144 and amphotericin 133 patients, the successful outcome was seen in 52.8% of patients on voriconazole as compared to 31% of patients on amphotericin B group. Even complete response was higher as compared to the amphotericin B group by voriconazole. Then they divided analyze the patients, and if we see the response in extrapulmonary infection, it is quite high with voriconazole as compared to amphotericin. But for all different subgroup analysis, voriconazole had better outcome as compared to amphotericin B. Voriconazole even turned out to have mortality benefit in patients as compared to amphotericin B. When they looked at the side effects in this study, the renal impairment was quite significant in patients with amphotericin B, while liver abnormalities were quite significant in patients with hepatic with voriconazole, though it didn't turn out to be statistically significant. One more study which showed that patient whom galactomannan was used to monitor the response to treatment, so the patient with voriconazole had better and earlier response as compared to amphotericin for aspergillosis. Recently, they have even tried a combination therapy for invasive aspergillosis. So, where they use an annular fungin with voriconazole, and they concluded that compared with voriconazole monotherapy, combination therapy with annular fungin led to higher survival in subgroup of patients with invasive aspergillosis. So, though it is not officially recommended, but it does show a better response. So, coming back to IDSA guideline, so primary therapy for patient with invasive aspergillosis is voriconazole. The dose recommended for adults is 6 mg per kg every 12 hourly for on the first day, and which is followed by 4 mg per kg every 12 hour. Once we shift to oral dosages, it is 200 mg twice a day. The alternative is liposomal amphotericin, which is 3 to 5 mg per kg per day intravenously. Coming to specific involvement of aspergillosis, so invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, as I have mentioned, the dose, most of the therapy, sinus, tracheobronchial, even central, the central involvement or a cardiac involvement, the dose remains same. One thing which I would like to mention, even the IDSA it mentions in the guideline that for empirical and preemptive antifungal therapy, liposomal amphotericin B 3 mg per kg per day IV is preferred over voriconazole. Just a slide on mucormycosis. For mucormycosis, amphotericin B is still the drug of choice for initial therapy, and once the patient is stable enough, it can be stepped down to posaconazole or isavuconazole for a prolonged period. Coming to some details about voriconazole, so voriconazole, it has many liver injury and hepatotoxicity. So if you look at the package insert, what it mentions is it is recommended that the standard loading dose regimen may be used for, but the maintenance dose may be halved in decreased to 50% of normal in mild to moderate hepatic cirrhosis. And for advanced disease or CTPC cirrhosis, there is no data available. For patients with renal insufficiency, there was no dose adjustment was needed, and even if a patient was on hemodialysis, you can continue with the same dosages for voriconazole. For post-transplant patient, whenever we are considering voriconazole, we need to understand the drug interactions. So voriconazole and fluconazole obviously would not be recommended simultaneously combined, but voriconazole would increase sirolimus levels to significantly high level, and so in a patient who is on sirolimus, voriconazole should not be given. And even they increase the dose of cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So when we are giving voriconazole, we need to decrease the cyclosporin dose to 50% of its previous dose and tacrolimus dose to 1/3 of its previous dose. They require very frequent monitoring for that blood levels, trough levels, and the therapy should be guided by trough levels. For voriconazole, visual disturbances and hepatic toxicity remains the main side effects, and that we should be aware that all azole group have prolongation of QT interval. Now if we look at this study where they have compared voriconazole, isavuconazole and posaconazole for the management of invasive fungal infections. So if we look at this, there was no difference in mortality, length of stay, readmission or infection recurrence between the groups, or all these three groups. So all three are considered equal for management of invasive fungal infections. Now this is not in post-transplant patient, but this is in myelogenous leukemia or MDS, where they have compared posaconazole with voriconazole as a prophylactic regimen. And they found that posaconazole as well as voriconazole both can be used as a prophylactic. Overall, posaconazole may be much more tolerable as compared to voriconazole. Similarly, in patients with hematological malignancies, they studied that posaconazole and voriconazole have same prophylactic effect, but safety of posaconazole is superior to that of voriconazole. But if we consider cost effectiveness, voriconazole has an advantage over posaconazole. So the take home message, my last slide, is that once they develop invasive fungal infections, they have very poor outcome, they have very high mortality even after good treatment. We are often guided by beta-D-glucan and galactomannan, and they may be used to monitor the response to treatment, or where because of their high negative predictive value to rule out invasive fungal infection. The knowledge about specific type of antifungal drug is essential considering the duration, cost and safety profile of this drug. So the cost of the therapy is usually in lakhs when they develop invasive fungal infection, because the duration of therapy is months to 6 to 9 months. And if we do not have the results back, and we need to consider an empirical therapy where there is reasonable surety of some invasive fungal infection, amphotericin B is a good empirical therapy. Coming to the selection between the azole groups, I think posaconazole and voriconazole could be equal for prophylaxis of the drug, though posaconazole is preferred, but for treatment of invasive aspergillosis, voriconazole scores over posaconazole, because all guidelines mention it as voriconazole as the preferred agent. I'd like to thank you for attending this talk, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Yeah, sir, Vikas here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so sir, presentation was very